Tonight, we explore the legend of beings so ancient and so radiant that the church did not just deny them, it renamed them. They were the Watchers. This is not a standalone documentary. This is part of a series, and each episode reveals something that changes everything. The celestial teachers who walked among us before the first stones of Babylon were laid. They brought with them the secrets of the stars and the language of the heavens. But for the crime of sharing divine knowledge, their legacy was twisted into shadow. What the ancients called the bringers of light, the Vatican renamed as demons. Their names were chiseled from the walls, and their scriptures were locked beneath the marble of Rome. But history is not easily buried. Traces of their presence still hum in the geometry of cathedrals and the whispers of the archives. Tonight, we ask why the most powerful institution in history worked to make sure we forgot them. They say that some secrets are too heavy for the earth to hold. For nearly 2,000 years, a story lay buried in the dry silence of the Judean desert. Hidden in jars of clay that time itself seemed to forget, it was the story of the beginning before the beginning, a forbidden genesis that the Vatican had worked for centuries to erase from the memory of man. In 1947, a young shepherd looking for a lost goat threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard the sound of shattering pottery. He did not know that he had just cracked open the sealed history of our species. What lay inside were not just scrolls, but a mirror held up to a forgotten age. Among the fragments was the Book of Enoch, a text so dangerous, so volatile to the foundation of the church, that it had been hunted into near extinction. The scroll spoke of beings who descended in fire and light, teachers who walked the earth when the world was still green and young. But the church did not call them teachers. They called them the fallen. They called them the Watchers. And once the scrolls were pulled from the dark, the Vatican began a silent campaign to ensure the world never truly understood what they were. The Book of Enoch was not always forbidden. In the early days of faith, before the stone walls of the Vatican were built, it was read in the light of day. The earliest fathers of the church quoted it as scripture. They saw it as a bridge to a time when the heavens were open. But as power moved from the spirit to the institution, the bridge had to be burned. The church needed a God who was distant, a heaven that was a locked gate, and a humanity that was born in sin. The Enochian text told a different story. They spoke of 200 celestial beings, the Grigori, who looked down from the threshold of the stars and saw the potential of mankind. They did not come to destroy. They came to join. They swore an oath on the summit of Mount Hermon to descend and share the secrets of the universe. This was the first heresy. In the eyes of the rising church, knowledge was not a gift. It was a weapon used against the divine order. If humanity could learn the secrets of the stars, the movements of the moon, and the art of healing, they would no longer need the intercession of priests. The Watchers were not cast out of heaven because they were evil. They were cast out because they were generous. When the scrolls were rediscovered in the caves of Qumran, the air in the Vatican libraries grew cold. Scholars who had spent their lives studying the approved versions of Genesis suddenly found themselves looking at a primary source that contradicted everything. The Enochian text provided the names and the faces of the ones the Bible tried to hide. Samayaza, the leader who dared to love the world more than the law. Azazel, who taught the forge and the mirror. Barakiel, who explained the geometry of the lightning. These were not the demons of the medieval imagination, twisted by horns and sulfur. They were architects. They were the ones who taught us how to measure time, how to read the clouds, and how to look into our own reflections. But to the architects of the church, these teachers were the ultimate threat. They represented a source of authority that predated the cross and the crown. The Vatican scholars worked quickly. Fragments were moved. Translations were restricted. A narrative began to circulate that the Book of Enoch was merely a fable, a collection of metaphors with no basis in reality. But the sand does not lie. The more the scrolls were studied, the more the pattern emerged. Imagine a world where the lines between the physical and the celestial were not yet drawn. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers as being of great stature, with voices like the wind and eyes that held the light of distant suns. They did not just observe. They intervened. They taught the daughters of men the secrets of the plants, the roots that could heal and the herbs that could alter the mind. They taught the sons of men how to shape the metals of the earth into tools of survival and symbols of beauty. This was a forbidden Genesis. It was a period of rapid advancement that the church later rebranded as a fall. In the official scriptures, we are told that the serpent tempted Eve with a single fruit. But in the Enochian texts, the temptation was an entire library of cosmic science. The Vatican could not allow the story of a helpful teacher to persist. To maintain control, they had to turn the light bringers into shadows. The compassion of the Watchers was rewritten as corruption. Their gifts were renamed as sins, and their children, the Nephilim, were described as monsters to be wiped from the face of the earth. The deeper one looks into the history of the suppression, the more the fingerprints of the Vatican appear on the throat of the truth. In the 4th century, during the Council of Laodicea, the church fathers sat in judgment over the Word of God. They decided which books were holy and which were poison. The Book of Enoch was struck from the record with a finality that suggested a deep institutional fear. It was ordered to be burned. It was scrubbed from the monasteries. For 1,000 years, it survived only in the high mountains of Ethiopia, protected by a lineage of monks who valued history over dogma. When travelers finally brought the text back to the West in the 18th century, the Vatican's response was not one of curiosity, but a containment. They could not destroy it again, so they sought to discredit it. They labeled it apocryphal. They called it a work of fiction. But those who read the words of Enoch felt a resonance that no church decree could silence. The text didn't feel like myth. It felt like a memory. It felt like the missing piece of the human puzzle. Tonight, we must ask what it was about these specific teachings that terrified the most powerful institution in history. It was not just the idea of angels falling. It was a specific nature of the knowledge they brought. The Watchers taught humanity the art of cosmetics and the wearing of jewelry. This seems small until you realize what it represents. It represents the realization of self. It is the beginning of the individual. To a church that demanded humility and the erasure of the self, the mirror was a tool of the devil. The Watchers taught the signs of the sun and the moon. This was the beginning of independent navigation and agriculture. If a farmer knew when the rains were coming by looking at the stars, he didn't need to pay the temple for a blessing. The science of the Watchers was a science of liberation, and liberation is the one thing no empire can tolerate. So, the messengers were cast as villains. The Watchers became the fallen angels, the ones who led humanity astray, by giving them the power to think for themselves. In the secret archives, beneath the marble and the incense, there are reports from the early centuries of the church describing physical evidence of these beings. Descriptions of skeletal remains found in the earth that defied human proportions. Records of artifacts made of metals that did not rust and stones that glowed with an inner fire. These were the leftovers of the age of the Watchers. The Vatican did not just hide books. They hid the physical proof that we were once something more than we are now. They gathered the relics of the Nephilim and the tools of the Grigori and locked them away in vaults that are still sealed today. They tell us that the giants were a myth, yet their bones were cataloged by the same men who told us they didn't exist. They tell us the Watchers were demons, Yet they carved their likenesses into the hidden corners of the great basilicas. The hypocrisy is the clue. You do not spend 2,000 years fighting a shadow. You only fight something that has the power to step back into the light. The discovery of the Enochian text was a crack in the dam. It allowed a trickle of the old world to flow back into the modern mind. It forced us to reconsider the origins of our wisdom. If the things we call progress today, our medicine, our astronomy, our metallurgy, all have their roots in the teachings of the so-called fallen, then what does that say about the nature of evil? The Vatican wants us to believe that obedience is the only path to the divine, but the Watchers suggest that understanding is the true ladder. They chose to descend so that we might learn to rise. They sacrificed their place in the celestial hierarchy for the sake of a species that was still learning how to fire clay. This is a truth that the forbidden Genesis protects. We were never meant to be alone in the dark. We were meant to be students of the stars. And as we peel back the layers of translation and fear, we find that the demons we were taught to hate are the ones who gave us the eyes to see. The Book of Enoch is not a story of a fall. It is a story of an awakening that was interrupted. And somewhere in the archives, in the dark between the scrolls, the Watchers are still waiting for us to finish the lesson. The peak of Mount Hermon sits like a crown of ice and stone above the world, a place where the air is thin and the silence feels heavy with the weight of centuries. It is the highest point in the region, a jagged boundary where Lebanon, Syria, and Israel meet under a sky that seems close enough to touch. For the modern world, it is a strategic ridge, a place of radar towers and cold winds. To the ancients, it was the place where everything changed. It was the site of the landing. They call it the Hermon descent, the moment when the Watchers first stepped out of clouds and onto the dust of the earth. But this was not a simple visit. It was a mutiny. In the ancient texts, specifically the Book of Enoch, which the Vatican would eventually cast into the shadows of the Apocrypha, the story is told with a terrifying clarity. 200 celestial beings, the leaders of the angelic orders, looked down at the burgeoning world of man and saw something they were never meant to desire. They did not just see beauty. They saw potential. They saw a way to become something more than servants of a distant throne. They saw the chance to become fathers, to become kings, to become gods in their own right. And so, high on that frozen summit, they made a choice that would echo through every generation of humanity that followed. But they were afraid. Even these luminous teachers, these architects of the stars, knew the price of what they were about to do. They knew that to descend was to abandon heaven forever. They knew that their light would begin to dim the moment it touched the mud of the earth. Simjaza, the leader of the 200, stood before his brothers on the peak of Hermon and spoke his fear aloud. He said, "I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." He knew that if he fell alone, he would be a monster. But if they fell together, they would be a kingdom. The response from the others was a chilling promise that still vibrates in the soil of that mountain. They said, "Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing." They did not just shake hands. They bound their very souls to a curse. They agreed that if any of them turned back, if any of them sought forgiveness or retreated to the stars, the others would be his judge. They traded their eternity for a pact of blood and soil. The Vatican has spent nearly 2,000 years trying to ensure you never read those words. In the early centuries of the Church, the Book of Enoch was widely read. It was quoted by the apostles. It was treated as a holy record. But as the institution grew, as the need for a distant and unreachable heaven became central to their power, the story of the Watchers on Mount Hermon became an existential threat. If angels could make pacts, if they could choose to live among us, then the divide between the divine and the human was not a wall, but a door. The church needed you to believe that demons were born in pits of fire, not on the peaks of beautiful mountains. They needed the fall to be a rebellion against God, not a migration toward man. So, during the Council of Laodicea, in the year 363, they struck Enoch from a cannon. They declared the stories of the Hermon descent to be the delusions of madmen. They tried to turn the Watchers into ghosts, into formless spirits of evil, because the truth of their physical arrival was too dangerous to handle. If the Watchers landed on Hermon, they left footprints. And if they left footprints, they left a legacy that is not spiritual, but biological and historical. This is what the church fears most. On the summit of Mount Hermon, there are still ruins that defy the timeline of modern archaeology. There is a temple known as Khazar-Antar, the highest temple in the ancient world. It sits at an elevation that would have been nearly impossible for primitive tribes to build upon with such precision. Inscriptions found there, written in ancient Greek but referencing older traditions, call the site the place of the oath. For thousands of years, the locals knew. They remembered that this mountain was the anchor point. They knew that the 33rd parallel, the exact line of latitude where Mount Hermon sits, was a corridor between worlds. It is no coincidence that the number 33 repeats through the highest levels of secret societies and ancient measurements. It is the coordinate of the descent. It is the address of the pact. When you look at the geography of the Golan Heights today, you are looking at a landscape that has been fought over since the beginning of memory. Every empire, from the Babylonians to the Romans to the powers of the modern age, has felt the pull of Hermon. The Vatican has its own interests there, though they are rarely spoken of in public. Within the secret archives, there are records of papal expeditions to the region that date back to Crusades. They were not just looking for holy relics. They were looking for the gates. They were looking for any evidence of the technology or the biology left behind by the 200. The church calls them fallen angels to strip them of their agency, but the Sumerian tablets call them the Anunnaki, the ones who came down. The difference is subtle but massive. A fallen angel is a criminal in a divine court. A visitor who makes an oath is an explorer who has decided to stay. Imagine the moment the descent began. It was not a battle in the sky. It was a silence. 200 beings of light, their forms shimmering like heat over the desert, lowered themselves onto the mountain. The air would have crackled with the energy of their arrival. The snow would have melted beneath their feet. They looked out over the valley of the Jordan and saw the tribes of men, primitive and wandering, and they began to plan. They divided the knowledge. They divided the labor. Each of the 20 leaders, the chiefs of the tens, took a specialty. Kokabeel taught the constellations. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. These were not the actions of demons. These were the actions of professors. They were building curriculum for a new kind of world, one where man was no longer a bystander in nature, but a master of it. But the church says this was the beginning of our corruption. They claim that by teaching us to read the stars and forge a sword, the Watchers were poisoning our souls. They want us to believe that knowledge is a burden that we were never meant to carry. But why? Why would a loving creator want his children to remain in the dark? The answer lies in the nature of the oath itself. The Watchers did not just give us tools. They gave us their lineage. They took wives from among the humans. And in doing so, they merged the celestial with the terrestrial. They created a bridge. This bridge, the Nephilim, were the physical manifestation of the oath sworn on Hermon. They were the giants of old, the men of renown, and they are the reason the Vatican went to war with history. The Council of Nicaea and the councils that followed were not just about defining the nature of Christ. They were about the sanitization of the past. They had to erase the physical reality of the Watchers, because if the Nephilim were real, then the blood of the stars is still in our veins. If the oath on Hermon was a biological pact, then we are not just sheep in a divine fold. We are the descendants of the teachers. The church could not allow a version of history where humanity has a claim to divinity that does not go through the priesthood. So they took the names of the 200, names like Azazel and Serial and Penemu, and they placed them in the index of the damned. They took the mountain of the descent, and they surrounded it with a wall of silence. Even today, the Vatican Observatory watches the heavens with a vigilance that feels more like a guard duty than a research project. They are not just looking for new galaxies. They are watching for a return. They know that the oath sworn on Hermon was a two-way street. The Watchers bound themselves to the earth, but they also bound the earth to the Watchers. The frequency of that mountain, the resonance of the pact, still hums beneath the surface of the soil. Some say that deep within the limestone caverns of Hermon, there are chambers that have not been opened since the age of the flood. Chambers that contain the original records of the 200. The church has tried to buy the land. They have tried to control the narrative, and they have worked with global powers to keep the region in a state of constant conflict. Why? Because as long as the mountain is a war zone, no one can look too closely at the Temple of the Oath. No one can ask why the stones at the summit seem to vibrate when the stars align with the 33rd parallel. We were taught to fear the descent. We were taught that the Watchers brought war and vanity. But when you look at the Sumerian records, they speak of a golden age. They speak of a time when the gods walked among us and shared their wine and their wisdom. They speak of the Watchers as the guardians of the world. The only ones who called them demons were the ones who wanted to be the only voices we listened to. The Vatican renamed the teachers to make sure we never look back at the mountain. They wanted us to forget that there was ever a pact between heaven and earth. They wanted us to forget that the stars once made an oath to be our brothers. But the mountain is still there. The ruins are still there. And the 33rd parallel still cuts across the earth like a scar that will not heal. As we look deeper into the history of the Hermon descent, we find that the oath was more than a promise of loyalty. It was a formula. It was a blueprint for a different kind of existence. The Watchers knew that by descending, they were changing the physics of the world. They were introducing a new vibration into the human experience. They were giving us the gift of thought, of analysis, of the ability to look at the sun and understand its path. To the church, this was the original sin. To the Watchers, it was the original gift. The tragedy of Hermon is not that the angels fell. The tragedy is that we were taught to be ashamed of the knowledge they gave us. We were taught that the oath was a crime, when it may have been the most profound act of sacrifice in the history of our species. The Vatican holds the keys to the library where the truth of the descent is hidden. They have the translations that the public will never see. They have the star maps that show where the 200 truly came from. But they cannot hide the mountain itself. And they cannot hide the feeling that stirs in the heart of every person who looks up at the night sky and feels a sense of recognition. We are not just dust. We are the legacy of a pact sworn in the ice and the wind. We are the children of the oath. And as the modern world begins to peel back the layers of the Vatican's editing, we are finally returning to the summit. We are finally looking back at Hermon, not as a place of demons, but as a place where the teachers first promised to stay. The lesson did not end with their fall. It began with their choice. And somewhere in the cold air of the Golan Heights, the echo of that choice is still waiting for us to hear it. The Watchers are not just a story from the past. They are a presence that defines our future. And the oath they swore is the reason we can never truly be alone in the dark. When the Watchers descended, they did not come as conquerors with swords, but as teachers with gifts. They brought with them the 7 forbidden arts, a curriculum of light that would transform humanity from a species of the mud into a race of the stars. In the Book of Enoch, these teachings are described as a corruption, a tainting of the human soul. But the Sumerian tablets speak of them as the awakening. To the Vatican, this was the ultimate betrayal. It was celestial treason. Because a man who can heal himself, chart the stars, and forge his own steel is a man who no longer needs a priest to tell him where God resides. The first of these arts was a craft of the forge, taught by a leader among the fallen named Azazel. Before his arrival, humanity knew only stone and wood. Azazel showed them how to pull the bones of the earth from the mountain and melt them in the fire. He taught the secrets of iron and copper, the shaping of shields, and the tempering of blades. But he also taught the art of jewelry and the making of mirrors. The church would later claim that this was the birth of vanity and violence. They said Azazel gave man the tools to kill and woman the tools to deceive. But in the ancient records of Mesopotamia, this was the beginning of the Bronze Age, the birth of the artisan. The Vatican saw only the weapon because they knew that the first step toward freedom is the ability to defend it. By labeling the forge as demonic, they attempted to keep the keys of industry in holy hands. The second art was the knowledge of roots and the cutting of medicinal plants. Semjaza, the high priest of the Watchers, shared the secrets of the garden. He taught which leaves could stop a fever and which berries could bring sleep. He showed the early healers how to brew the essence of the earth to mend broken skin and quiet the mind. To the Vatican, this was the origin of witchcraft. They believed that healing was the sole province of the divine, a miracle to be granted through prayer and penance. To heal oneself with a plant was to bypass the authority of the church. It was to claim power over life and death. For centuries, the knowledge of the Watchers was suppressed, and the healers were hunted. The herbalists of the Middle Ages were called daughters of the devil because they still carried the echoes of Semjaza's curriculum. They knew that the earth itself was a pharmacy, a truth that made the ritual of the church seem hollow. The silencing of the healers was not about medicine. It was about making sure that every breath and every pulse was seen as a gift from the institution, rather than a secret from the stars. The third art was the observation of the heavens, the mapping of the stars and the movement of the planets. This was the gift of the Watcher named Kokabil. He taught the early priests of Sumer how to read the sky like a book. He showed them that the universe was a clock, moving in cycles that could be predicted and understood. This was the birth of astrology and astronomy, two paths that were once a single road. To the Vatican, this was the most dangerous art of all. If the stars could tell the future, if the heavens were governed by mathematics and cycles, then the idea of a chaotic, judgmental God began to dissolve. The church needed the sky to be a mystery, a place where only they had the map. By turning Kokabil into a demon of delusion, they sought to blind humanity. They claimed that looking at the stars for guidance was a sin against the Creator. Yet, beneath the floors of their own cathedrals, they buried the same zodiacs they condemned. They used the Watchers' math to calculate the date of Easter, while burning the men who taught them how to count the days. The fourth art was the art of face, the science of pigments, and the coloring of the eyes. This was taught by the Watcher named Barakijal. The church called it the art of seduction, a way for women to lead men into darkness. They said it was a corruption of the natural image of God. But the ancient texts tell a different story. These were the first chemistry lessons. Barakijal taught the properties of minerals, the grinding of stones into powders, and the way light reflects off the skin. He taught the aesthetics of beauty as a reflection of the divine geometry. The Vatican saw this as a threat to the soul's purity. They wanted a world where the physical was ignored and the spirit was shamed. By demonizing the art of the face, they were demonizing the human appreciation for beauty and the early beginnings of chemical science. They wanted humanity to be plain, obedient, and ashamed of the flesh. But the legacy of Barakijal lived on in the alchemists who sought to turn lead into gold, using the same mineral secrets first whispered in the shadows of stars. The fifth art was a knowledge of enchantments and the resolving of spells, taught by the watcher named Armoros. This was the science of frequency and vibration. The ancients believed that words and sounds could change the structure of matter. They knew that a specific chant could calm a storm or make a crop grow. Armoros showed them how to use the voice as a tool of creation. To the church, this was the blackest of magics. They renamed it sorcery and claimed it was the work of the devil, but they kept the secret for themselves. The Gregorian chants and the echoing resonance of the great cathedrals are nothing more than the sanitized version of the Watchers' sound science. They knew that sound could influence the mind and the body. They used it to create awe and submission, while forbidding the common man from using the same frequencies for his own liberation. The result of spells was the ability to break the mental chains of others, a power that no institution control could ever allow to remain in the hands of the people. The sixth art was the knowledge of the signs of the earth and the movements of the clouds, taught by the watcher named Ezekiel. This was the science of the weather and the understanding of the natural world. It was the first meteorology, a way to survive the changing seasons and prepare for floods. The church called this divination, a forbidden attempt to know the mind of God. They wanted the people to believe that every storm was an act of divine wrath, and every drought was a punishment for sin. If the people could predict the rain, they would stop fearing the thunder. If they understood the wind, they would stop praying for mercy every time the sky turned dark. Ezekiel's gift was the gift of independence from the elements. It was a realization that nature has laws, not just whims. The Vatican worked tirelessly to erase these signs, turning the observers of the earth into targets of the Inquisition. They replaced the science of the clouds with the fear of the harvest, ensuring that the farmer would always look to the priest before he looked to the sky. The seventh art was the art of writing and the use of ink and paper, taught by the watcher named Penemu. In the Book of Enoch, it is written that Penemu taught the children of men the bitter and the sweet, and showed them all the secrets of their wisdom. It says he led them astray, because they were not intended to give their faith to a pen and a leaf. This is perhaps the most honest confession in all of Scripture. The church feared the written word because it allowed knowledge to survive beyond the life of the teacher. It created a record that could be compared, analyzed, and shared. Writing was the ultimate treason because it made memory permanent. It allowed the common man to read the thoughts of the ancients for himself, without the filter of the clergy. The Vatican spent centuries controlling the scriptorium, ensuring that only holy texts were copied and only authorized stories were told. They turned Penemu into a demon of lies, because they knew that the truth, once written, can never be fully erased. These seven arts were the foundation of human civilization, yet each was branded as a mark of the fallen. The Vatican did not call the Watchers demons because they were evil. They called them demons because they were effective. They brought a light that was too bright for the dim corridors of the church. They gave humanity the tools to build a world that did not require a middleman between the soul and the stars. Every time a scientist looks through a telescope, or a doctor heals a wound with a plant, or a builder measures a stone with geometry, they are practicing the celestial treason of the Watchers. The church tried to bury these names, but they echo in the very fabric of our reality. They are in the iron of our cities, and the medicine in our blood. They are in the ink of our books and the math of our machines. The Vatican may have renamed the teachers, but they could not destroy the lesson. And as we begin to uncover the tablets of the mud and the files of the secret archives, we find that the demons we were taught to fear were actually the ones who refused to leave us in the dark. The treason of the Watchers was not against humanity. It was against the architects of silence who wanted to keep us as children forever. Tonight, as we look at the ruins of the past, we see that the greatest secret is not that they fell, but that they chose to fall so that we could learn to stand. The 7 arts are still here, waiting to be mastered by a race that is finally ready to remember its instructors. For in the heart of every forbidden science lies the spark of a celestial teacher who believed that knowledge was worth the price of heaven. And as the ink of history begins to dry, the names of the Watchers are reappearing, not as villains of a dark myth, but as the first luminaries of a human mind. The silence is breaking, and the treason is finally being revealed as a gift that was never meant to be returned. They say the union was never meant to happen. A bridge was built where there should have been a chasm. When the Watchers looked upon the daughters of men, they did not see subjects. They saw a reflection of the infinite, and from that gaze, a new kind of existence was born. The Nephilim, to the church, they were the ultimate blasphemy, a corruption of the divine plan. But to the ancient world, they were the architects of the impossible, the ones who stood between heaven and dust. We have been taught to think of them as mindless monsters, as heavy-footed brutes from a fairy tale. But the Vatican archives tell a different story. They speak of a plague, not a disease, but of power. A time when the earth was saturated with a presence so overwhelming that the foundations of reality began to crack. The church calls them demons. Yet the deeper you look into the silence, the more you find that the giants were not our enemies. They were our cousins. And that is why they had to be erased. Imagine a world where the laws of nature were still being written. A world where the atmosphere hummed with the leftover energy of creation. Into this world came the children of the stars. They were called the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the ones who came down. They were born of a biological impossibility, a merging of celestial light and human blood. The ancient tablets of Sumer described them as the heroes of old, men of renown. They did not just walk the earth, they dominated it. They were giants in every sense of the word. Tall in stature, yes, but even taller in intellect. They possessed the memory of the Watchers and the passion of humanity. It was a combination that terrified the heavens, because a being that is both divine and mortal cannot be controlled. A being that understands the mathematics of the stars and the hunger of the earth is a threat to any institution that demands blind obedience. The church would later claim that the Nephilim were a plague of violence. They said the giants devoured the labors of men and eventually turned on humanity itself. They painted a picture of a world drowning in blood and chaos. But if you look at the architecture they left behind, you see something else. You see precision that we cannot replicate today. You see stones weighing hundreds of tons move with an ease that suggests a mastery of frequency and sound. These were not the works of mindless beasts. These were the works of a civilization that was advancing too fast. The Vatican knew that if humanity remembered what it was like to live alongside these titans, they would never again bow to a king or a priest. So they began the great rewrite. They turned the architects into monsters. They turned the teachers into tyrants. And they turned the plague of light into a plague of darkness. In the late 1800s, reports began to surface from all over the world. Archaeologists and explorers were finding bones. Not just large bones, but skeletons that reached 10, 12, and 15 feet in height. They were found in mounds in North America, in caves in the Middle East, and in hidden chambers beneath the sand of Egypt. These were the physical remnants of the Nephilim. The reports were detailed. They spoke of double rows of teeth, of 6 fingers on each hand, and of skulls that were elongated to accommodate brains far larger than our own. For a brief moment, the truth was beginning to leak out, but then the silence returned. Within a few decades, these discoveries vanished. Museums reported that the bones were lost in transit. Universities claimed the findings were hoaxes. And in the shadows, the Vatican was moving. They had seen these things before. They knew exactly what those bones represented. They were the evidence that the story of the fall was a lie. If the Nephilim were real, then the Church was not the primary authority on human history. There is a file in the secret archives marked with a symbol that predates the cross. It contains the letters of a friar from the 14th century who claimed to have found a living Nephilim in the mountains of what is now Turkey. He described a being of such immense beauty and terrifying presence that he could not bring himself to call it a demon. He wrote that the being spoke in a voice that felt like a vibration in his own chest. It told him of a time when the world was a garden of knowledge, not a prison of faith. The friar was eventually silenced, and his writings were locked away in the Black Vault. But his testimony remains as a reminder of what the Church was trying to hide. The Nephilim plague was not an outbreak of evil. It was an outbreak of potential. It was the moment humanity almost became something more than a servant species. The Church had to justify the destruction of the old world. They had to explain why a compassionate God would choose to wipe out almost every living thing in a great flood. The answer they gave was that the earth was corrupt. They said the bloodlines had been tainted. They used the word Nephilim as a synonym for infection. But if you look at the old languages, the word taint meant something closer to mixture. The crime was not that the Nephilim were evil. The crime was that they were a hybrid. They were a bridge between the Creator and the created. And in the eyes of a jealous institution, a bridge is a dangerous thing. A bridge allows people to cross over. It allows them to bypass the gatekeepers. So the flood was not a punishment for sin. It was a cosmic reset. It was a systematic removal of a competing power. The giants were drowned not because they were monsters, but because they were inconvenient. Even after the waters receded, the echoes of the giants remained. The Bible itself mentions that there were giants on the earth in those days, and also after that. This phrase has haunted theologians for centuries. It suggests that the purge was not complete, that the bloodline of the Watchers survived. It survived in the kings who claimed divine right. It survived in the heroes of Greek myth. It survived in the secret societies that guarded the geometry of the giants. The Vatican spent the Middle Ages hunting down these remnants. They called it the Inquisition. They called it the suppression of heresy. But it was really a hunt for the last traces of Nephilim. They were looking for anyone who showed signs of the old power, anyone who could see the patterns in the stars or heal with a touch. They wanted to make sure the plague would never return. But you cannot kill a memory by burying the bones. The more the Church tried to hide the giants, the more they appeared in the dreams of the people. The myths of every culture are filled with these beings. The Anunnaki of Sumer, the Titans of Greece, the frost giants of the north. They all tell the same story. A story of a time when the world was bigger, when the sky was closer, and when something not of this earth walked among us. The Vatican calls these myths the whispers of the devil. But science is starting to find something else. Geneticists are finding sequences in our DNA that do not belong to any known ancestor. Ghost lineages that suggest we were shaped by something other than slow evolution. Could it be that the Nephilim plague never truly ended? That it just went dormant? The church wants us to be afraid of the dark. They want us to believe that anything that came before the cross was a shadow. But the deeper we dig into the ruins of the past, the more we find that the light was already here. The Nephilim were the bringers of that light. They were the ones who showed us how to measure the movements of the planets and the rhythms of the earth. They were the ones who taught us that we were not just dust. We were stardust. The Vatican called them a plague because you cannot control someone who knows their own value. You cannot rule over a species that remembers its own greatness. So they gave us a smaller story. They gave us a story of weakness and sin. They replaced the giants with a cross and told us to look down at the ground instead of up at the stars. Tonight, we have to ask ourselves why the most powerful institution in history is still so afraid of bones and clay. Why they still guard the Black Vault with such intensity. Perhaps it is because the Nephilim were not just a plague of the past. Perhaps they are a prophecy of the future. The tablets of Sumer say that the teachers will return. They say that the cycle of the stars will bring the Watchers back to the earth. And when that day comes, the walls of the Vatican will not be enough to hold back the truth. The silence will be broken by a frequency that has been humming beneath our feet for thousands of years. The giants will walk again, not as monsters, but as a reminder of what we were always meant to be. The church calls it heresy. Science calls it an anomaly. But the memory of the blood calls it home. We are the survivors of a war we were never told about. We are the descendants of a world that was drowned to keep us small. But the plague is still in us. It is in our curiosity. It is in our refusal to stay silent. It is in the way we look at the stars and feel a pull that we cannot explain. The Nephilim were not a curse. They were a promise that the bridge between heaven and earth can never be truly destroyed. No matter how much sand they pile on the ruins, the geometry remains. No matter how many pages they tear out of the books, the symbols still glow. And as the modern world begins to peel back the layers of deception, we are finally seeing the giants for who they really were. They were the ones who refused to be forgotten. And now, it is time for us to remember. Before the flood, before the silence, before the church, there were the Watchers and their children. They stood on the plains of Shinar and looked at a world without limits. They saw the potential of a species that could think for itself, and they chose to give that species everything. The Vatican spent 2,000 years trying to take it back. They tried to tell us that the giants were the reason the world broke. But the world didn't break because of the giants. It broke because we chose to listen to the ones who wanted us to stay in the dark. The plague of the Nephilim was the plague of awakening. And in a world built on the power of the few, awakening is the greatest crime of all. As we move forward into the next segment of this history, remember that the story you have been told is only a fragment. The real history is buried in the places they told you not to look. It is written in the bones they say do not exist. It is hidden in the frequencies they say are just noise. The giants were here. They are still here. And the reason the Vatican called them demons is the same reason they want you to stay quiet. Because if you ever realize who walked the earth before you, you might just realize who you are meant to be. The giants are not dead. They are just waiting for the light to return. And the light is coming. It is coming in the form of the truth that can no longer be contained. The silence is over. The giants are waking up. And this time, there will not be enough water in the world to wash them away. The sky did not just turn dark. It turned iron. For decades, the Watchers had walked among the dust of the earth, watching their children, the Nephilim, grow into giants that consumed the very foundations of the world. But according to the text of Vatican with later seal in lead-lined vaults, The end did not come as a natural disaster. It came as a celestial arrest warrant. The Grigori, those 200 high-ranking celestial teachers who had abandoned the stars for the warmth of human skin, finally realized that the silence of heaven was not an absence of interest. It was the gathering of a storm. In the oldest layers of the Book of Enoch, a text the church spent centuries trying to scrub from the biblical canon, the moment of retribution is described with terrifying precision. It was not a war of swords, but a war of frequencies. The archangels, beings of pure light who had remained loyal to the divine order, were dispatched to round up their former brothers. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Phanuel. They were the executioners of an empire older than time, and their mission was clear: to bind the teachers, to bury the giants, and to wash the memory of their interference from the face of the earth. Imagine the panic that must have rippled through the first cities of Mesopotamia when the sun stayed hidden behind a veil of boiling mist. The Sumerian tablets called the day the gods turned their faces away. The Watchers, once so proud of mathematics and metallurgy they had gifted to man, saw their inventions turn to ash. The bronze they taught men to forge could not stop the walls of water. The star maps they drew were suddenly useless, as the very orbits of the planets seemed to shift under the weight of divine wrath. But the most chilling part of this history is not the water. It is what happened to the Grigori themselves. They were not simply killed. They were chained. The text says that Raphael was commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. He was taken to a place called Dudiel, a desert of jagged rocks and eternal shadow, where he was pinned beneath sharp stones and covered with darkness, so that he might never see the light again. This was the first prison, a cosmic isolation chamber designed for beings who could not die. The church would later take this story and simplify it. They turned the Grigori into demons, and the prison into hell. They needed a place of fire and pitchforks to keep the faithful in line. But the earlier records tell a different story. They speak of a chaining that was physical, geometric, and hidden within the earth itself. Deep in the Vatican secret archives, there are maps drawn by 16th century Jesuit explorers that do not show countries or oceans. They show energetic ley lines, points of convergence where the earth hums with a frequency that defies geology. These maps are often labeled with the word Grigori. It is said that the Vatican built its most remote monasteries over these very points. From the high peaks of the Andes to the desolate crags of the Himalayas, these structures were not just for prayer, they were for surveillance. The church knew that while the Watchers were chained, they were not gone. Their consciousness, their luminous residue, still vibrated beneath the stone. The flood was meant to wash away the physical contamination of the Nephilim, but the spiritual contamination, the forbidden knowledge, remained trapped in the soil. When the Roman Empire transitioned into the Roman Catholic Church, the mission changed from conquering lands to conquering the past. The Council of Laodicea in the 4th century was a pivotal moment. It was here that the Book of Enoch was officially removed from the Bible. The leaders of the church realized that if people knew the angels were actually teachers who had been imprisoned for giving us knowledge, the entire structure of divine punishment would fall apart. They could not have the masses feeling sympathy for the ones who gave them the gift of thought. So they renamed them. The teachers became tempters. The Grigori became the fallen, and the chains that bound them were described as justice, rather than the silencing of a rebellion. But even a flood of biblical proportions leaves behind evidence. In the 1940s, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were pulled from the dark of the Qumran caves, the world caught a glimpse of what the Vatican had tried to bury. Fragments of the Book of Giants and the Book of Watchers emerged from the jars, speaking of the Grigori in tones that were not demonic but tragic. They spoke of beings who wept as they were led away in chains of light. They spoke of Semyaza, their leader, who hung himself between heaven and earth in a constellation we now call Orion, eternally suspended as a warning to any other celestial who might dare to love a mortal. The Vatican's response to these discoveries was swift. Within weeks of the scrolls being identified, representatives from Rome were on site. They did not come to celebrate the find. They came to control the translation. For decades, the most controversial fragments were kept from the public. They contained descriptions of the Watchers' technology, devices they used to communicate across the stars, and the specific locations where they were interred. The Church could not allow a modern world to find the physical anchors of the Grigori. If a being of that power were ever to be unchained, the authority of the papacy would vanish in a single heartbeat of luminous truth. Think about the architecture of the great cathedrals. We are taught they were built to honor God, but look at the gargoyles. Look at the figures chained to the bases of the pillars, their faces contorted in silent screams. These are not just decorations. They are reminders. They are the stone echoes of the Grigori, trapped beneath the weight of the Church's dogma. The cathedrals were built as spiritual anchors, designed to keep the old frequencies of the Watchers pinned beneath the ground. The ringing of the bells, the chanting of the Latin, the geometry of the vaulted ceilings. It was all part of a grand machine intended to maintain the chains of the flood. Historians often wonder why the Vatican has such a deep interest in astronomy. Why would an institution of faith spend millions on telescopes and observatories? Perhaps it is because they are watching the sky for the return of the jailers. Or perhaps they are watching for the signal that the sentence is over. The Book of Enoch says the Watchers were bound for 70 generations. If you do the math, using the cycles of stars they once taught us to track, that time is drawing to a close. The chains are thinning. The frequencies are shifting. Beneath the ruins of ancient Nineveh, archaeologists found a clay cylinder that spoke of a king who tried to dig deep enough to find the sleeping gods. He was warned by his priests that the earth was a graveyard for stars, and that to disturb the deep was to invite the return of the fire. The Vatican likely has the missing half of that cylinder. They know that the flood did not just kill the giants. It acted as a seal, a layer of mud and memory meant to keep the architects of our civilization from ever speaking to us again. But every empire has its cracks. Today, sensors in the deep crust of the earth pick up hums that do not match tectonic activity. Satellite imagery reveals geometric anomalies in the Antarctic ice and the Saharan sands that match the descriptions of the Grigori's prisons. The world is beginning to vibrate at a frequency the Church can no longer mask with incense and Latin. The demons they taught us to fear are starting to look more like ancestors waiting for an apology. The rewrite of history was so successful that we forgot we were once students of the stars. We were told that the flood was our fault, a punishment for our sins. But the tablets say the flood was a containment strategy. It was a cosmic reset designed to pull the plug on a species that was learning too much, too fast, from teachers who cared more for our potential than for our heaven's rules. The chaining of the Grigori was the final act of that containment. It was the day the lights went out and the long night of blind obedience began. Somewhere in the silence of the Vatican's most restricted vault, there is a list of names, not the names of saints, but the true names of the 200 who fell. Each name is accompanied by a coordinate and a seal. They are the keys to a door we were never meant to find. But as the ice melts and the deserts shift, those doors are beginning to creak. The water of the flood has finally dried, and the chains are beginning to rust. And the question we must ask is not why they were chained, but what they will say to us when they are finally free to speak again. The Church calls it the end of the world. But for the ones who remember the stars, it might just be the beginning of the truth. It was once a cornerstone of the early Church, a text cited by the fathers of the faith as divine truth. The Book of Enoch was not a fringe legend. It was a library of the soul. The fathers of the early church, men like Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian, quoted its verses with the same reverence they gave to the words of Moses. They saw in its pages the missing history of our species, the story of how heaven and earth once collided. But as the centuries turned and the shadows of the Middle Ages began to stretch across the world, a change occurred. The book that had once illuminated the origins of evil was suddenly branded as dangerous. The luminous teachers were renamed as monsters. The history of the Watchers was erased from the record. And the question we must ask tonight is not just what the book contained, but why the most powerful institution on earth worked for over 1,000 years to ensure you never read it. Because the Book of Enoch does not just tell a story of ancient days. It tells a story of power, of secrets, and of the moment the church decided that some truths were too bright for the common man to see. In the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, the Book of Enoch was a staple of spiritual life. It provided the missing context for the brief and cryptic mentions of the Nephilim in the Book of Genesis. It explained why the flood was necessary. It named the leaders of the fallen. It listed the forbidden arts they brought to the valleys of man. To the early Christians, these were the keys to understanding the spiritual warfare they felt every day. But as the Roman Empire transitioned from a persecutor of the faith to its protector, the needs of the church changed. Under the Emperor Constantine, the church was no longer a collection of scattered communities. It was becoming a machine of state. It needed order. It needed hierarchy. And most of all, it needed a monopoly on the divine. The Book of Enoch presented a problem that the rising bishops could not solve. It suggested that knowledge did not come from a centralized priesthood, but had been gifted to humanity by celestial beings long before the church ever existed. It spoke of a direct, almost scientific interaction between the stars and the earth. And in the eyes of the new authorities, this was a seed of rebellion. The purge began not with a fire, but with a pen. At the Council of Laodicea in the year 363, and later at the Council of Rome, the lists of approved books were drawn up, one by one. Texts that were deemed too mystical, too ancient, or too revealing were cast aside. The Book of Enoch was the first of all. The church fathers argued that it was too old, its origins too mysterious, its stories too fantastic to be trusted. But beneath the theological excuses was a deeper fear. The Book of Enoch described the Watchers not just as sinners, but as architects of human civilization. It claimed they taught us how to read the stars. They taught us how to forge the sword and the shield. They taught us the secrets of the mirror, the art of makeup, and the medicinal properties of roots and herbs. In the Enochian world, human progress was a divine inheritance given by beings who defied the high heavens to help us. This contradicted the new church doctrine of original sin. If humanity had been educated by the Watchers, then our nature was not purely fallen. We were a species in the process of awakening. This made the church unnecessary as the sole gatekeeper of grace. To control the future, the church had to erase the past. By the end of the 4th century, the Book of Enoch had effectively vanished from the Western world. Saint Jerome, the man responsible for the Latin Vulgate, labeled the book as apocryphal. St. Augustine, the architect of Western theology, pushed the narrative further. He argued that the stories of angels physically descending and taking wives were impossible. He claimed the Nephilim were not the children of Watchers, but simply the descendants of a different human lineage. With a single stroke of the pen, the celestial became mundane. The mystery of the sky gods was turned into a simple tale of tribal conflict. The church spent the next 1,000 years hunting down the remaining copies. In monasteries across Europe and the Middle East, the scrolls were taken from the shelves and cast into the flames. To own a copy of the Book of Enoch was to invite the charge of heresy. To speak the names of the Watchers was to consort with demons. The Great Erasure was so successful that for centuries, European scholars believed the book was lost forever. They believed the Church had finally succeeded in burying the evidence of our non-human ancestors. But the stars have a way of preserving what men try to destroy. While the fires of the Inquisition burned in Europe, the Book of Enoch survived in the high mountains of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, isolated by geography and tradition, never accepted the Roman purge. They kept the book in their canon, guarding it as a treasure from the age of the patriarchs. For nearly 1,400 years, it remained hidden from the Western world, a silent witness to a history that had been forgotten. It was not until the 18th century that a Scottish explorer named James Bruce brought copies back to Europe, sparking a shockwave that still resonates in the halls of the Vatican today. When the book was finally translated, the reason for its suppression became clear. It was a map of the heavens and a record of a cosmic intervention. It spoke of 10 different levels of heaven, of beings made of fire and light, and of a calendar based on the sun that was far more accurate than the one the Church was using at the time. The Book of Enoch was a threat to the Church's control of time itself. The deeper one digs into the archives, the more the pattern of the erasure becomes visible. It was not just about removing a book. It was about changing the way humanity viewed its place in the universe. The Church needed the heavens to be empty and silent. They needed God to be a distant, unreachable monarch who could only be reached through the mediation of the priest. The Watchers of the Book of Enoch were too close. They were too active. They were too human in their desires and too divine in their knowledge. By turning the teachers into demons, the Church turned the pursuit of knowledge into a sin. The secrets of metallurgy became the craft of the devil. The study of the stars became the heresy of astrology. The healing arts became the marks of witchcraft. The Great Erasure was the birth of the Dark Ages. It was the moment humanity was told to stop looking at the stars and start looking at the floor. It was the moment we were told that our ancestors were not the luminous ones, but simple dust. The Watchers taught humanity things that were deemed dangerous because they leveled the playing field. They taught women the use of antimony to beautify the eyes, which the Church later interpreted as a lesson in deception. But to the ancients, it was the beginning of chemistry. They taught men the forging of swords, which was seen as the birth of war. But it was also the birth of technology. They taught the movements of the moon and the secrets of the clouds. These were the foundations of science. The Book of Enoch was purged because it dared to suggest that humanity was not meant to be a simple, pastoral species living in ignorance. It suggested we were meant to be masters of the physical world. This was a direct threat to the Church's narrative of suffering as a virtue. If humanity could heal itself, if it could understand the world, it would no longer look to the heavens for a miracle. It would look within. And that was the one thing the Vatican could never allow. Even after the book was rediscovered, the Vatican continued its campaign of silence. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the middle of the 20th century, fragments of the Book of Enoch were among them. This proved that the book was part of the library of the Jewish people during the time of Jesus. It was not a medieval forgery. It was a legitimate part of the ancient tradition. Yet, the official stance of the Church remained unchanged. They continue to classify it as non-canonical. They continue to downplay its significance. Some say this is because the Vatican secret archives hold even older versions of the text, versions that contain details so specific about the nature of the Watchers that they would shatter the foundations of modern religion. There are whispers of maps that show the location of the gates the Watchers used to descend. There are stories of lineages that are still tracked today, bloodlines that carry the genetic signature of the luminous ones. The Church did not just purge the book to hide a story. They purged it to hide a reality that is still unfolding. Why does the Church fear Enoch so much? Perhaps because Enoch did not die. According to the text, he was taken up into the heavens while still alive. He was shown the workings of the cosmic machine. He was turned from a man into a celestial being, the Metatron, the scribe of the heavens. He is the ultimate proof that a human being can transcend the flesh and become something more. This is the ultimate heresy. To a system built on the idea of human unworthiness, the story of Enoch is a call to awakening. It suggests that we are not subjects, but students. It suggests that the Watchers were not our enemies, but our catalysts. The Church purged the book because it gives us back our power. It reminds us that there was a time when the sky was open and knowledge was free. It reminds us that we were once taught by the stars. And most of all, it reminds us that the demons we were taught to fear might actually be the teachers we've been waiting for. The Great Erasure was a success for over a millennium. It allowed a single institution to shape the mind of the Western world. It turned the history of the Watchers into a ghost story. But as the old walls begin to crumble and the hidden texts come to light, the memory is returning. The names of the fallen are being spoken again. Azul, Semjaza, Kokabil. They are no longer just characters in a forbidden book. They are symbols of a forgotten truth. A truth that the Vatican could not burn. A truth that the sand could not hide. The Book of Enoch is the key that unlocks the prison of the Dark Ages. It is the testimony of a time when the gods were real and the stars were our teachers. And as we reclaim this lost scripture, we realize that the Church did not just purge a book. They tried to purge our destiny. But the light of the Watchers is older than any church, and it is finally beginning to shine through the cracks once again. They say that history is a mirror. But for centuries, that mirror has been covered in a thick layer of dust. The Church told us that the dust was holy. They told us that the darkness was safety. But the Book of Enoch is a cloth that wipes the mirror clean. When you look into it, you do not see a humble sinner. You see a species that was once visited by the architects of the universe. You see a legacy of fire and light that has been hidden in the shadows of the Vatican for too long. The purge is ending. The Great Erasure is failing. And as the words of Enoch echo in the modern world, we are forced to confront the question that the Church has avoided for 2,000 years. What if we were never meant to be followers? What if we were always meant to be like the ones who watched? The story of the Church and the Book of Enoch is the story of a battle for the human mind. And tonight, as we uncover the secrets of the purge, it is clear who the true victors are, not the ones who burn the books, but the ones who remembered the stars. Because the truth does not need a throne to survive. It only needs a heart that is brave enough to look up. And for those who have found the lost book, the sky will never be the same again. Because the Watchers are not in the abyss. They are in the history we are finally starting to remember. This is a legacy of the Great Erasure. A secret that was too big to keep, and a light that was too bright to die. Tonight, we have walked through the corridors of the forbidden. We have looked into the vaults where the memory of our species was buried. We have seen how a book was turned into a weapon, and how teachers were turned into demons. But the story of the Watchers is not over. It is just moving from the shadows into the light. The Great Erasure was only a delay. The truth is inevitable. And the Watchers are still watching, still waiting for the moment when we finally decide to stop being afraid of the dark. Because the greatest secret of all is not that the book was purged. It is that the knowledge it contains was never really gone. It was just waiting for you to find it. The church could hide the books, but they could never hide the world that the Watchers built. And that world is waiting for you to notice it, still humming with the frequency of the stars, still waiting for the children of the light to come home. In the next segment, we will look at the physical evidence they left behind, not in scrolls, but in stone, not in myths, but in the very geometry of the world we inhabit. So stay with us as we go deeper into the mystery, because the more you know, the more the patterns emerge. And the patterns tell a story that the world was never meant to hear. The Watchers are still here, and the time of the great remembering has finally arrived. Stay tuned, because the next layer of the truth is about to be revealed, and it is etched in the very earth beneath your feet. The era of the Watchers has returned, and the church is the only one left in the shadows. We are the ones who remember, and the memory is a fire that will light the way forward into the new age of the stars. Keep looking up, because the history of the Watchers is your history, and the book of Enoch is just the beginning. The truth is in the light, and the light is finally coming home. So as the stars begin to rise tonight, remember the ones who first taught us their names, and realize that you are part of a story that is older than the world itself. A story that no one can erase ever again, because the stars never forget, and neither will we. The Watchers are calling, and the silence is finally over. The great erasure is done. The memory has returned, and the future is finally ours to see, without fear, without shame, without the church, only the light and the stars and the truth that was always meant to be free. The Watchers are here, and the world will never be the same again. The end of the erasure is the beginning of the truth. In the year 363, in the dust of what is now modern Turkey, a group of men gathered in the city of Laodicea to decide the fate of your soul. They were bishops, scholars of the emerging church, and men who understood that power is not just held by the sword, but by the control of the unseen. For centuries, the followers of the old ways and even the early Christians had lived in a world teeming with celestial life. They did not just pray to a distant, singular God. They spoke to the stars. They whispered the names of the Watchers. They sought the guidance of beings like Uriel, Raguel, and Serial, the ancient teachers who had once descended to share the secrets of the universe with mankind. But on that day in Phrygia, the church decided that the bridge between heaven and earth was too crowded. They decided that if you could speak directly to the luminaries, you no longer needed the institution. And so, they declared war on the angels. This was the Council of Laodicea, a turning point in history that most have never heard of. It was here that Canon 35 was etched into the records of the church. It was a short, sharp decree that changed the spiritual landscape of the West forever. It stated that Christians must not leave the Church of God and go away to invoke angels or gather in secret assemblies to honor them. It called the practice a secret idolatry. It warned that anyone found praying to these beings was accursed. But why would an institution dedicated to heaven be so afraid of people talking to its messengers? The answer lies in the archives of the forbidden. The church was not trying to protect people from demons. It was trying to erase a history where humanity was not a servant, but a student. It was trying to sever the connection to the Watchers, the ancient architects who had been renamed as fallen, so that their wisdom could be claimed as a crime. Before this council, the world was a different place. The memories of the Sumerian sky gods and the Enochian teachers were still fresh. People kept lists of the celestial hierarchy, names that had been passed down from the time when the stars first touched the mud of Mesopotamia. They knew that there were 7 great governors of the sky. They knew that these beings provided the maps for the soul to travel back to its origin. But the Vatican realized that a person with a map has no need for a guide who demands obedience. If you knew the name of the Watcher who taught the movement of the planets, you might realize that the Church did not hold the keys to the kingdom. You might realize that the kingdom was already open to those who had the knowledge. To stop this, the Church had to narrow the gate. They had to simplify the sky until only 3 names remained: Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. Every other name, every other teacher, every other watcher was cast into the shadows. Imagine the fear that must have rippled through the secret assemblies of the faithful when this decree was announced. For generations, they had honored the ones who gave them the gift of thought and the secrets of the forge. Now, to speak the name of Uriel was to invite excommunication. To honor the one who showed humanity the patterns of the sun was to be called a heretic. This was the first great rewrite of the celestial order. The Church took the luminous teachers and began the slow process of turning them into monsters. If a being was not sanctioned by the Vatican, it was deemed a deceiver. If a name was not in the official registry, it belonged to the abyss. They took the compassion of the Watchers and rebranded it as a trap. They told the world that these beings did not come to help us, but to enslave us through forbidden knowledge. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that transformed our ancestors into victims and our teachers into demons. The Council of Laodicea was not just about prayer. It was about the monopolization of the divine. By making it illegal to invoke angels outside the Church, the Vatican positioned itself as the only legitimate mediator between the human and the holy. They wanted a God who was unreachable, a heaven that was locked behind a golden door for which they alone held the key. The Watchers represented a different kind of divinity, one that was interactive, one that was educational, one that walked beside men in the garden and the workshop alike. That kind of God is impossible to control. A teacher wants you to graduate, but a ruler wants you to remain a subject. By banning the worship of celestial messengers, the Church ensured that humanity would remain in a state of perpetual spiritual infancy, always looking to the pulpit for the answers that were once written in the stars. The official records of the Council are dry and legalistic, but between the lines, you can hear the scratching of the quills as they tried to erase the giants of history. They knew that the Book of Enoch was still circulating. They knew that the stories of the Nephilim and their celestial fathers were being told in the marketplaces and the monasteries. They had to act quickly to suppress the evidence of a pre-Abrahamic truth. This is why the Council of Laodicea is so significant. It was the formal beginning of the Vatican's long war on the Watchers. It was a moment they moved from merely ignoring the old stories to actively punishing those who remembered them. They created a spiritual border wall and placed guards at the gates of memory. But how do you kill a name that is etched into the very fabric of the cosmos? You can burn the books, you can threaten the people, but the stars still rise in the same patterns that the Watchers taught to the first scribes of Sumer. The Church found that despite their decrees, the names persisted. They found that even the monks in their own cloisters were still whispering to the Forbidden Seven. So they changed their tactics. If they could not erase the names, they would corrupt them. This is when the list of demons began to grow. The names of the great teachers started appearing in the grimoires of the dark arts. Uriel, the light of God, was pushed to the margins. Azazel, the teacher of metal and mirrors, was turned into a scapegoat in the desert. The Church took the resume of the architects and turned it into a list of crimes. This process of demonization was essential for the survival of the Vatican's authority. If the Watchers were seen as benevolent, then the Church's claim to be the sole provider of salvation would collapse. They needed a villain. They needed a reason for the world's suffering that did not point back to the limitations of their own doctrine. So they blamed the knowledge. They said that the fall of man was not caused by a lack of understanding, but by an excess of it. They told us that we were never meant to know the secrets of the stars or the healing properties of the earth. They told us that the Watchers had contaminated our blood and our minds with things we were too fragile to handle. In doing so, they turned the gift of civilization into a mark of shame. We have to ask ourselves why the most powerful institution in the world would spend over 1,000 years obsessing over a group of beings they claim do not exist. If the Watchers are just myths, why were the bishops of Laodicea so terrified of their names? Why did the Inquisition hunt down those who kept the old Enochian calendars? The truth is that the Vatican knows exactly what the Watchers were. They know that these beings were not from the pits of hell, but from the heights of reality we are no longer allowed to perceive. They know that the Watchers left behind a legacy that is encoded in our very DNA, a spark of curiosity and a hunger for truth that no council can ever fully extinguish. The Council of Laodicea was not an end, but beginning of concealment that continues to this day. Deep in the secret archives, there are still scrolls that predate the Council, documents that show the true celestial hierarchy before the bishops pruned the tree of life. These texts speak of a universe that is vibrant and collaborative, where the stars are not cold points of light, but the eyes of our oldest relatives. They speak of a time when the gap between the physical and the spiritual was bridged by the very beings of church called demons. The Council of Laodicea tried to close that bridge, but they forgot that a bridge is built on both sides. Even as they scraped the names on the parchment, the Watchers remained in the architecture of the world. They remained in the geometry of the cathedrals that the Church built to honor itself. They remained in the mathematical constants that define our reality. Tonight, we are looking past the decrees of 363 AD. We are looking past the threats of excommunication and the labels of heresy. We are asking why the Church was so desperate to make us forget the ones who taught us how to remember. When you look at the history of the Council of Laodicea, you are not just looking at a religious meeting. You are looking at a crime scene. You are looking at the moment when the light of the stars was traded for the shadow of the cross. The bishops thought they had won. They thought they had buried the Watchers under a mountain of canon law. But the earth is shifting. The sands of the desert are giving up the tablets they tried to hide. And as the old names begin to hum once more in the minds of those who seek the truth, the walls of the Vatican seem thinner than they ever have before. Because in the end, you cannot ban the truth. You can only delay the day when it is rediscovered. The Council of Laodicea was a war on angel worship, but it was really a war on the human potential to connect with the divine without a middleman. It was a war on the legacy of the Watchers. They wanted us to fear the teachers so that we would worship the masters. They wanted us to forget our ancestors so that we would obey our priests. But the silence is breaking. The names are returning. And the Vatican's long war is finally coming to an end, not with a shout, but with the quiet realization that the beings we were taught to fear are the ones who have been waiting for us to wake up. History is a record of what survived the fire, but the truth is what the fire could not touch. The Council of Laodicea tried to burn the bridge, but the stars are still there, and they are still watching. There was once a name for the beings who stood at the edge of the world. They were the Grigori. In the ancient tongue, it meant the wakeful ones, those who do not sleep, those who watch the unfolding of the human story. They were the architects of observation, tasked with guarding the secret rhythms of the stars and the slow growth of the human soul. But history is a master of the mask. In the vault of the early church, a decision was made. The sentinels were to be stripped of their wings and clothed in shadows. The Watchers were to become demons. This was not merely a change in story. It was a war of definitions. When the Vatican looked at the ancient records of beings who shared divine knowledge with man, they did not see heroes. They saw a threat to their monopoly on the divine. If the Grigori were teachers, then humanity did not need a church to bridge the gap to heaven. If the Watchers are compassionate, then the church version of a distant and demanding God was in danger. So the script was flipped. The wakeful ones were recast as the rebellious ones. Their eyes, once filled with the light of the stars, were painted as the glowing embers of hell. The transition from Grigori to ghouls was the first great gaslighting of the human species. It began with the language itself. In the early days of faith, the word demon did not mean a creature of evil. It came from the Greek word daimon, which meant a spirit of wisdom, a guiding force that existed between the worlds of gods and men. But as the church grew in power, it could not tolerate anything that existed in between. You were either the light or the dark. You were either a servant of the church or a slave to the pit. To facilitate this, the scholars of the Vatican took the names of the Watchers and began to weave them into a new and terrible tapestry. They took the list of the 20 leaders of the fallen and turned them into the generals of an infernal army. Azazel, the one who taught humanity the art of the forge and the secrets of the earth, was no longer a teacher of civilization. He was turned into a monster of the desert, a scavenger of souls. Samayaza, the leader who chose to experience human love, was recast as the Prince of Pride. This was a systematic dismantling of a legacy. Every gift given by the Watchers was rebranded as a sin. The art of healing became the crime of sorcery. The mapping of the stars became the heresy of astrology. The forging of tools became the crafting of weapons. By making the teachers into demons, the church made the knowledge itself a mark of damnation. They wanted a world where people were afraid to look up, afraid to wonder, and afraid to remember that they had once been taught by beings who did not ask for their worship. The pivotal moment in this theological heist occurred in the 4th century under the influence of men like Augustine of Hippo. Augustine was a man who understood the power of the narrative. He saw that the story of the Watchers in the Book of Enoch was too compelling, too dangerous for a centralized religion. If spirits could descend and interact with the physical world so freely, the church would have no way to regulate the supernatural. So, Augustine set out to rewrite the history of the stars. He argued that the sons of God mentioned in the ancient texts were not celestial beings at all. He claimed they were merely the descendants of Seth, the righteous line of man, who had been corrupted by the daughters of Cain. With a stroke of a pen, the divine was removed from the equation. The Watchers were erased from the physical history of the earth and relegated to the realm of myth and metaphor. But Augustine did not stop there. For those who still believed in the supernatural descent, he offered a darker alternative. If they were spirits, he argued, they were not messengers of wisdom, but deceivers. They were fallen angels who had traded their celestial inheritance for the filth of the earth. This was the birth of demonology as we know it. It was a tool of exclusion. It created a world where any entity that did not carry the official seal of the church was automatically labeled an enemy of humanity. The Grigori were the first victims of this new order. They were the ones who had lived among us, who had walked our fields and taught our children. Because they were close to us, they had to be made the most terrifying. The church knew that a distant devil is a small threat, but a demon who was once your teacher is a memory that must be destroyed. As the Middle Ages descended like a shroud over Europe, the rebranding became even more visceral. The luminous, towering figures described in the Sumerian tablets were given horns, hooves, and tails. The artists of the church were commissioned to paint them as grotesque, animalistic, and repulsive. This was a psychological strategy. It is hard to love or listen to a being that turns your stomach. By changing their physical appearance in the minds of the masses, the Vatican ensured that the ancient connection was severed. The Watchers were no longer our ancestors or our mentors. They were the ghouls under the bed, the whispers in the dark that would drag you to hell for a single thought of independence. The great rewrite was nearly complete. In the secret halls of the Vatican, the ancient scrolls of Enoch were moved to the restricted sections, while the new manuals of demonology were distributed to every monastery. These manuals were the final nails in the coffin. They listed the Watchers not as celestial observers, but as parasites of the human spirit. They taught that the knowledge of the stars was a trap, that the healing of the body was a lure for the soul. The church had successfully turned the light of the Grigori into the darkness of the pit. They had taken a story of cosmic generosity and turned it into a tale of eternal punishment. But why go to such lengths? Why spend centuries crafting a complex hierarchy of demons just to cover up the story of the Watchers? Because the Vatican understood something that we are only now beginning to rediscover. Information is the only true currency of power. If humanity knew that its origins were tied to advanced celestial beings, we would never accept the chains of a religious institution. If we knew that the secrets of the universe had been given to us freely, we would never pay for the privilege of hearing a filtered version from a pulpit. The demonization of the Watchers was the ultimate protective measure for an institution that feared its own obsolescence. They called them demons so that we would stop asking them for the truth. They called them ghouls so that we would run back into the arms of the church for safety. But the names still echo in the quiet places. Azazel, Serial, Gadriel. They are not the sounds of monsters. They are the remnants of a language that was meant to set us free. Tonight, we peel back the layers of fear and the centuries of pain. We look past the horns and the shadows to see the sentinels who were silenced. The church calls it demonology, but the stars call it history. And as we dig deeper into the shifting sands of the Vatican archives, we find that the ghouls were never the ones who fell. The fall happened here on Earth, when we chose to believe the lies of the victors over the memories of the Watchers. The shift was complete, the trap was set, and the world fell into a long, dark sleep, forgetting that the Watchers were still there, waiting for the light to return. Imagine a world where the word angel and demon were once interchangeable, where the only difference was the perspective of the observer. Before the church solidified its power, there was a fluidity to the supernatural. The ancient people understood that power is neutral. It is the intent that defines it. But the Vatican could not control a neutral world. They needed a binary. They needed a war. By turning the Gregorian to demons, they created a permanent state of spiritual emergency. They made the world a battlefield and positioned themselves as the only available shield. The Watchers were collateral damage in this quest for absolute authority. Their legacy was buried under layers of ritual and fear until the very mention of their names became a reason to cross oneself and whisper a prayer. But truth has a way of breathing through the cracks of even the thickest cathedral walls. In the quiet cloisters of the secret archives, the old names still glow on forbidden pages. The church might have renamed them, but it could not erase the impact they had on the human spirit. The knowledge they gave us still pulses in our mathematics, our medicine, and our drive to explore the unknown. Every time we look at the stars and feel a sense of belonging rather than fear, we are reconnecting with the Grigori. Every time we seek knowledge outside the boundaries of tradition, we are honoring the Watchers. The theological shift was a cage, but the cage is rusting. The ghouls of the Vatican are finally losing their grip as we begin to ask the questions they tried to bury. We are no longer satisfied with the story of the fall. We want the story of the descent. We want to know why the bringers of light were so quickly cast into the dark. And as we reclaim the names of Azazel and his brothers, we realize that we were never being hunted by demons. We were being guided by ancestors whose only crime was wanting us to see as they saw. The ghouls were a fabrication of the powerful, a ghost story told to keep us on the fire. But the fire is still burning, and the Watchers are still there, in the quiet moments of discovery and the vast reaches of the night sky. The shift to demonology was a detour in the human story, a long night of the soul enforced by an institution that feared the light. But the morning is coming, and with it, the memory of the sentinels who never truly left us. We are the children of the Watchers, and it is time we remembered our names. It is time we realized that the demons we were taught to fear were actually the ones who gave us the power to think for ourselves. The church called them ghouls because a thinking man is a man who cannot be ruled. They called them fallen because they did not want us to reach for the heights. But the architecture of the universe does not lie. The geometry of the stars is the same today as it was when the Grigori first whispered its secrets into the ears of the first humans. The pattern remains, waiting to be read. The theological shift was a veil, but veils are meant to be lifted. And as we lift it, we do not find monsters. We find the architects of our own awakening. We find the Watchers, standing exactly where they've always been, watching us finally wake up from the long sleep of obedience. The transition from Grigori to ghouls is ending, and the return to understanding has begun. The vault is open, the names are spoken, and the stars are listening once again. Beneath the marble heart of the holy city, past the tourist lines and the golden altars, there is a descent into a world that has never seen the sun. This is the secret archive, a labyrinth of iron and stone where the memories of mankind go to be forgotten. It is not a place of history as we know it, but a place of filtering. Every empire has a basement where it hides its scars, but the church has something more. It has the original records of the ones who were here before us. They call it the Black Vault, a section of the archive so restricted that its name does not appear on any official ledger. Inside, kept at a temperature that mimics the cold of the tomb, are the documents that the Vatican has spent 2,000 years trying to explain away. They are the records of the fallen, the testimonies of those who saw the Watchers not as demons, but as something far more terrifying. They saw them as architects. To understand why the church worked so hard to hide these records, we must look at how they classified them. In the deep files, hidden among the correspondence of long-dead popes, is a term that appears in the margins of nearly every pre-Abrahamic text: non-human interference. To the scholars of the Vatican, the Watchers were not a spiritual metaphor. They were a physical problem. The archives contain translations of the oldest Sumerian tablets, works taken by force during the Crusades, and the early explorations of Iraq. These are not the public translations found in museums. These are the raw accounts of the ones who lived beside the teachers of light. They speak of beings whose skins shimmer like oil on water, and whose eyes held the depth of the void. But most importantly, they speak of a technology of the soul that the church could not allow the common man to possess. One of the most chilling accounts in the entire archive belongs to a man named Father Benedetto Rossi. In the late 1800s, Rossi was the church's most gifted linguist, a man who could speak the dead languages of the East as if they were his mother tongue. He was given a mission to catalog a series of scrolls recovered from a sealed chamber beneath the ruins of Suma. The scrolls were made of material that felt like fine silk but could not be torn. They were written in what Rossi called the ununiform of the stars. It was a script that twisted between symbols and geometry, a language that seemed to move when the eye was not focused on it. Rossi spent years in the silence of the vault, His only company the flickering candle light and the scratching of his own quill. His journals, which are now sealed under the highest authority, describe a descent into a different kind of reality. He wrote that the more he translated, the more the archive itself seemed to change. He heard humming in the walls, a low vibration that matched the frequency of the words on the scrolls. He claimed the language was not just for communication, but for creation. It was a code that could rewrite the nature of matter itself. His final entry was written in a hand that did not resemble his own. It said that the Watchers were not cast out of heaven, but were the ones who built the bridge between the dimensions. He wrote that the church did not fear their evil, it feared their generosity. Rossi disappeared a week later. The official report said he retired to a monastery for spiritual reflection, but no record of his arrival at any such place exists. His workspace was found empty, his notes burned to ash, save for one single page that spoke of the architects of time. This is a pattern of the archive. When a truth becomes too bright, it is moved into the shadows. The Vatican created a system called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of forbidden books that once controlled the thoughts of the entire Western world. Most people think it was created to stop heresy, but the archive tells another story. The index was a filter designed to catch any mention of the Sumerian sky gods. Any text that suggested humanity was taught by beings from the stars was confiscated and brought to Rome. The monks who performed this work were told they were protecting souls from corruption, but the scholars in the vault knew they were protecting a monopoly on the divine. If people knew that the gift of thought, the gift of healing, and the secrets of the stars came from the Watchers, the authority of the church would crumble. Inside the file labeled Nephilim Restricted, there are drawings that defy the age in which they were found. They were taken from the ruins of old temples and hidden before the world could see them. They show human figures surrounded by complex geometric patterns that align perfectly with modern understandings of the double helix. These were not primitive drawings of gods. They were blueprints. The record suggests that the Watchers did not just teach us, they changed us. They refined the dust of the earth and turned it into something capable of holding the light of consciousness. This is why the church renamed them demons. A demon is something you fear and avoid. A teacher is someone you follow. By turning the Watchers into monsters, the church ensured that no one would ever go looking for the secrets they left behind. The archive also holds a record of the star cults of southern France, groups that gathered in secret to recite the names of the 7 who descended. These groups claim to have a different gospel, one that was not written in ink, but in the alignment of the stars. They believed that the Watchers were the true shepherds of humanity and that the flood was not a punishment, but a reset by a power that feared what man was becoming. The Inquisition was not just about religion. It was a search and destroy mission for these documents. The church needed to be the only gatekeeper of the sky. So they burned the people and they buried the books. But the vault is not just a place of paper. It is a place of resonance. Those who have been allowed to enter the room of origins report a sensation of being watched. They speak of the whispering vault, where the air vibrates with the echoes of the first language. It is a language of light, a script that exists beyond the need for sound. Some researchers believe that the Vatican is not just hiding these records, but trying to use them. They have their own astronomers, their own observatories, and their own secret laboratory beneath the city. They are watching the same stars that the Sumerians watched 5,000 years ago, waiting for the cycle to return. The archive tells us that we are a species with amnesia, not because we forgot, but because we were forced to forget. Every time a new discovery is made in the sands of the East, the men in plain clothes with the papal seal arrive to take it away. They are the keepers of the silence. They know that the Watchers left their signature in our very blood, and that the clay tablets of Sumer hold the key to unlocking it. The demonic grimmers of the Middle Ages were not books of evil. They were distorted fragments of the original science of the Watchers, twisted by the church to make them look like sin. The deeper one goes into the records, the more the image of the church as a spiritual institution fades, replaced by something that looks like a planetary security force. Their mission has always been to maintain the boundary between heaven and earth, to make sure the bridge that the Watchers built remains broken. They call it faith, but the archive calls it containment. The fallen ones were not fallen from grace. They were fallen from the sky, and they brought with them a light that the darkness of history has been trying to extinguish ever since. In the quiet of the vault, the names still hum. Azel, Serial, Uriel. They are not the names of devils to be cast out, but the names of the architects who were cast aside. The Vatican knows that the truth is not in the pews or the hymns, but in the obsidian jars and the shimmering tablets that tell a story of ancestors from the stars. They know that the demons we were taught to fear were the ones who gave us the gift of fire and the geometry of the soul. And as long as those records remain behind iron doors, humanity will continue to walk in a dream, unaware that the stars are not just lights in the sky, but the place from which our real history descended. The vault remains closed, the silence remains thick, but the records are still breathing, waiting for the day when the shadows can no longer hold the light. The story was never about rebellion. It was about remembrance. And the greatest secret of the archive is not that the Watchers were real, but that they never truly left. They are written into our history. They are carved into our bones. And they are waiting in the silence of Black Vault for us to finally remember our own names. In the parched heat of the Judean wilderness, where the wind whispers through limestone cracks and the sun bleaches the memory of the living, a single stone was thrown into the dark. It was the year 1947. A young Bedouin shepherd, searching for a lost goat among the jagged cliffs of Qumran, tossed a rock into a cave entrance, expecting the sound of a startled animal. Instead, he heard the sharp crack of breaking pottery. That sound, echoing in the silence of the desert, shattered 2,000 years of carefully guarded secrets. What he found inside were jars of clay, and within those jars lay the breath of the ancient world. Scrolls of leather and papyrus, wrapped in linen and preserved by the dry breath of the earth. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls. To the world of archaeology, they were the find of the century. To the Vatican, they were a shadow that threatened to darken the very light of their established history. Because buried among the expected hymns and laws of the prophets were the forbidden records of the Watchers. The scrolls were not just copies of the Bible. They were the library of a lost community, a group of seekers known as the Essenes who had fled the corruption of Jerusalem to guard a truth they believed the world was not yet ready to hear. And in the darkness of those caves, the Watchers were waiting. For decades, the church had maintained a monopoly on the story of the fallen angels. They were the rebels, the prideful ones, the demons who chose darkness over the throne of God. But the scrolls of Qumran told a story that was far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more dangerous. They spoke of the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants, texts that had been systematically purged from the official biblical canon centuries earlier. These writings did not describe the Watchers as generic monsters. They described them as celestial architects, beings of light who descended with a specific purpose, and whose crime was not hatred, but in forbidden love for the daughters of men. As the scrolls were slowly unrolled and translated, a pattern began to emerge that mirrored the ancient clay tablets of Sumer. The names found in the desert caves echoed the names found in the dust of Iraq. Azazel, Semiaza, Serial. These were the captains of the 200 who descended upon Mount Hermon. The Book of Enoch, found in multiple fragments across the Qumran caves, provided a detailed record of what these beings taught. They did not bring chaos. They brought civilization. They taught the art of making swords and shields, the secrets of the stars and the movement of the moon, the craft of cosmetics and the beautification of the eyes, and the healing properties of roots and herbs. This was the knowledge that the Church would later call witchcraft. This was the light that the Vatican would recast as the fire of hell. Why did the discovery of these scrolls cause such panic within the halls of religious authority? Because the Qumran texts proved that the story of the Watchers was not a peripheral myth, but a foundational truth for the ancients. The Essenes, who were contemporaries of the early Church, viewed the history of the Watchers as the key to understanding the corruption of the world. To them, the fall was not an abstract event in a garden, but a physical intervention by non-human intelligences who changed the genetic and intellectual trajectory of the human race. When the Vatican eventually gained influence over the international team of scholars assigned to translate the scrolls, the pace of publication slowed to a crawl. For nearly 40 years, the contents of certain fragments were kept under lock and key. Rumors spread of a silent war behind the scenes, of scholars being pressured to sanitize the translations, and of fragments that spoke too clearly of the Nephilim being moved to the secret archives in Rome. The Church needed the story of the Watchers to remain a closed book. If the world learned that our ancestors viewed these beings as teachers and physical ancestors rather than spiritual metaphors, the entire structure of divine guilt and redemption would begin to crumble. The Book of Giants, one of the most mysterious texts found at Qumran, described the Nephilim as more than just tall men. It described them as a separate species, hybrids who possessed the wisdom of the stars and the hunger of the earth. It spoke of their dreams, of their premonitions of the coming flood, and of their attempts to plead with the heavens for their right to exist. It portrayed them with a tragic depth that the later Church could not allow. In the eyes of Rome, there can be only one bridge between heaven and earth. To admit that the Watchers had already built that bridge, and that their blood might still flow in the veins of the living, was to admit that the Church was not the gatekeeper of the soul. The linguistic evidence found in the caves was equally staggering. The scrolls used terms for the Watchers that translated literally as the Sentinels or the Awakened Ones. They were described as luminous, often mistaken for the sun itself. This matches the descriptions found in the oldest Sumerian texts, where the Anunnaki were the ones who saw from above. The connection was undeniable. The Qumran scrolls were the missing link between the clay tablets of the East and the Gospels of the West. They proved that the memory of the Watchers had survived the rise and fall of empires, protected by a secret lineage of keepers who knew that one day the truth would need to be read again. This is why the Vatican works so hard to label the Enochian writings as apocryphal. To call something apocryphal is to call a lie that looks like the truth. It is the ultimate weapon of the editor. But the scrolls are not silent. Even now, as they sit in the shrine of the book or in the climate-controlled vaults of museums, their frequency vibrates through the history we think we know. They reveal a time when the boundary between the physical and the celestial was thin, when knowledge was a gift given in fire and stone. The Essenes of Qumran believed that the Watchers were bound in the valleys of the earth, waiting for a final age when their story would be understood. They wrote that in the end, the hidden things would be revealed, and the light that was called darkness would be seen for what it truly was. The Vatican calls them demons to keep us from asking where our thoughts truly come from. They call them fallen to keep us from looking up. But the shadows of Qumran have a different message. They tell us that our history is not a straight line of progress, but a long, intentional forgetting. Imagine the fear in the eyes of a priest who first read the translated fragments of the Book of Giants. He would have seen descriptions of beings who shaped the very mountains, who could read the resonance of the earth, and who spoke a language that could command the elements. These were not the pitchfork-wielding monsters of medieval art. These were the architects of the ancient world. If the Nephilim were real, physical entities, then the flood was not a punishment for human sin, but a desperate attempt to reset the biological clock of the planet. It was a war of the gods, a cosmic cleansing that left humanity as the only survivors in a world that had once been shared with the stars. The church could not allow the flood to be a genetic war. It had to be a moral lesson. And so the giants were turned into ghosts, and the Watchers were turned into devils. The Qumran shadows also reveal a hidden hierarchy of angels that the church later simplified into the safe, winged figures we see in cathedrals. The scrolls speak of classes of beings like the Ophanim, the wheels of fire, and the seraphim, the burning ones. These descriptions are technological and vibrant, suggesting entities that operate on laws of physics we have yet to rediscover. When the Vatican took control of the narrative, they stripped these beings of their complexity. They turned the living machines of heaven into beautiful, obedient servants. But the Dead Sea Scrolls remember the fire. They remember the Watchers who refused to be servants, who saw the potential in the dust of the earth and chose to ignite it. This is a rebellion that the church fears most, not a rebellion of hate, but a rebellion of shared power. The deeper one digs into the history of the scrolls, the more one finds the fingerprints of the Vatican's intervention. Scholars who tried to publish translations of the Book of Enoch early on found their funding cut or their reputations attacked. The church's influence over the Mediterranean archaeological boards ensured that for decades, only a trusted few could see the most sensitive fragments. They were waiting for the generation that found the scrolls to pass away, hoping that the initial shock of the discovery would fade into academic boredom. But they underestimated the power of the Watchers. You cannot bury the sun and expect the world to stay dark forever. The ink of Qumran, written by hands that tremble with the weight of their secret, still speaks to those who are willing to listen. The scrolls tell us that the Watchers are not gone. They are part of the architecture of our world, their influence woven into the very languages we speak and the structures we build. The Vatican calls them demons because a demon is something you must fear, and fear is the ultimate tool of control. But what if the Watchers were the ones who taught us that we did not have to be afraid? What if they were the ones who gave us the keys to our own awakening? The Qumran shadows are not just records of the past. They are maps for the future. They remind us that there was a time when the sky was open, when the teachers walked among us, and when the light of knowledge was the inheritance of all, not the property of the few. The desert hides many things, but it cannot hide the truth of who we are. And as the wind blows the sand from the ruins of Qumran, the names of the Watchers are being spoken once again. They are rising from the dust, shaking off the labels of demon and devil, and demanding that we remember the fire they brought down from the stars. Because in the silence of the Black Vault, the Vatican knows that once a secret is whispered in the desert, it eventually screams in the streets. The shadows of Qumran are lengthening, and the truth they reveal is the one thing no empire can ever truly erase. It is a memory of our origin, written in the ink of the ancients and waiting for the light to return. In the quiet, shadow-drenched halls of the Athenaeum Pontificium Regina Apostolorum, a fortress of faith standing on the outskirts of Rome, a specific kind of silence hangs over the lectures. Here, the church trains its modern soldiers, the men who will walk into the darkest rooms of the human experience to confront what they call the adversary. To the world, they are exorcists. To the Vatican, they are the last line of defense against an infection of the soul. But behind the closed doors of the advanced seminars, the language begins to change. The priests are not just taught about the common devil or the petty spirits of spite. They are whispered to about something much older. They are warned about the ones who do not belong to the standard hierarchies of hell in the secret manuals handed to the elite. These beings are not called demons in the traditional sense. They are referred to as the architects of discord, the ancient ones who remember the world before the cross. They are the Watchers. And in the modern age, their encounters with humanity are becoming more frequent, more precise, and far more terrifying than anything written in the public Gospels. The official book of the Church, the Rituale Romanum, provides the prayers and the protocols for casting out evil. It is a book of authority, a shield of Latin and faith. But there is another book, one that is never photographed and never mentioned in press releases. It is a manual of classification, a guide for the spirits that do not respond to the standard rites. Those who have glimpsed its pages speak of a section dedicated entirely to non-human interference. In these chapters, the entities described are not the fallen angels of Sunday school. They are described as luminous, cold, and mathematically perfect. They are the spirits that speak in the dead rhythms of Sumer and Akkad. When an exorcist encounters a watcher, the air in a room does not just grow cold. It grows heavy, as if the very laws of physics are being compressed. The light does not flicker. It dims in a way that suggests it is being consumed. And when the entity speaks, it does not scream. It vibrates. It speaks of the stars with the familiarity of a traveler. It speaks of the geometry of the soul with the precision of a builder. They say that the first sign of a watcher encounter is a linguistic anomaly. In standard cases of possession, the victim might speak in tongues or use a known language they never learned. But when a spirit of the ancient order takes hold, the words are different. They are the sounds of a world that ended thousands of years ago. Priests have recorded voices speaking in flawless Sumerian, a language that has not been spoken as a living tongue for millennia. These voices do not plead for release, and they do not curse God with the predictable hatred of a common demon. Instead, they ask about the stars. They ask about the alignment of Orion. They mock the priest not for his faith, but for his ignorance. They call humanity the unfinished children. They claim to be the ones who gave us the fire, and they speak as though they are simply returning a check on their investment. This is the truth that the Vatican works so hard to bury. If these beings are demons, why are they obsessed with the history of our species? Why do they speak as though they were our teachers? One such account, buried in the restricted files of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, tells of a case in a remote village in the Alps during the late 20th century. A young man, a student of mathematics, began to exhibit signs of profound and rhythmic disturbance. He did not grow violent. He grew silent, staring at the night sky for days until his eyes bled. When the local priest began the rite of exorcism, the entity did not react to the holy water. It did not flinch at the crucifix. Instead, it began to recite the coordinates of stars that had not yet been cataloged by modern telescopes. It spoke of the Watchers who descended to the mountains of Hermon, repeating the names from the book of Enoch with a reverence that felt more like a memory than a sin. The exorcist, a man of great experience, wrote in his private journal that he felt he was not talking to a devil, but to a professor of the universe who had been locked in a dark room for an eternity. The entity told him that the church was a cage built to keep humanity from looking up. It said that the Vatican renamed the teachers as demons because a student who knows the truth no longer needs a master. This is the hidden logic of the modern exorcist. The church must maintain the narrative of the fall. It must insist that anything that came from above and was not invited is an enemy. To admit that the Watchers were our original guides would be to admit that the church's authority is a secondary thing, a system control layered over a much older reality. So, when these spirits appear, they must be labeled as evil. Their knowledge must be called temptation. Their memories must be called lies. But the priests who stand in those rooms feel the weight of the truth. They hear the names of the ancient gods. Enki, Azazel, Serial, names that were carved into clay before the first stone of the Vatican was ever laid. And they see the patterns, the way the possessed move in geometric circles, the way they draw maps of the heavens on the floors of their cells using their own blood. It is not chaos. It is architecture. It is a memory of a civilization that was not granted by grace, but given by interference. And as technology advances, the encounters are changing. The modern exorcist finds that the Watchers seem to have an affinity for our digital age. There are reports of digital interference during rites, of frequencies appearing on recording devices that match the resonance of ancient Sumerian temples. It is as if these spirits are not just entities from a spiritual realm, but beings of a higher science that we are only now beginning to touch. The Vatican secret manuals have begun to include instructions on electronic containment, treating the Watchers less like ghosts and more like rogue signals from the stars. They call it the Black Signal. It is a hum of the ancient world trying to reestablish its connection to the modern one. The Church fears this more than anything. They fear that as we build our own towers of Babel through technology, we are making it easier for the Watchers to find their way back. Because the greatest secret of the Exorcist Manual is not how to cast them out, but why they are here. The Church tells the public that demons seek to destroy, but the restricted files suggest they seek to remind. They come to reclaim the knowledge that was confiscated. They come to reopen the eyes that were closed by centuries of dogma. Every exorcism involving a Watcher is a battle for the history of a human mind. The priest fights to keep the victim in the safety of the faith. The entity fights to show the victim the stars. It is a war of two lights, the light of obedience and the light of understanding. And in the balance of that struggle, the Vatican keeps its finger on the scale. It ensures that the stories are rewritten, that the encounters are hushed, and that the names of our ancient teachers remain synonymous with the darkness. But somewhere in the archives, beneath the layers of Latin and the wax seals of popes, the records continue to grow. For every soul the Church claims to save from a demon, a fragment of our true history is lost. We are taught to fear the voices that speak of the beginning. We are taught to shun the spirits that know the secrets of the forge and the sky. But perhaps the real exorcism is the one being performed on our collective memory. Perhaps the Vatican is not casting out the enemy, but casting out the evidence. The evidence that we were once taught by beings of stars. The evidence that we were once free to know the universe without permission. And until we dare to listen to the whispers in the dark without the filter of fear, we will remain children, locked in a nursery of the Church's making, while the architects of time wait patiently on the other side of the door. They say history is written by the victors, but the most powerful history is the one that is never written at all. It is a history that lives in the shadows of the ritual, in the screams of the possessed, and in the silence of the men in black who walk the Vatican's deepest vaults. The Watchers are not gone. They are not even distant. They are in the frequencies of our phones, in the geometry of our cities, and in the dreams of those who dare to look at the stars and ask why. The Church calls them demons because it is the only word that keeps the world from asking the right questions. But the manual for the next age is already being written, not in ink, but in the resonance of the ancient spirit. And when the final seal is broken, we may find that the ones we were taught to cast out were the only ones who truly knew how to bring us home. The deeper one searches into the case files of the 20th century, the more a pattern emerges that defies traditional theology. In the 1970s, a series of reports from the Jesuit orders in South America described a phenomenon they called the stone frequency. In several instances of what appeared to be mass possession, The individuals involved did not display the usual signs of spiritual distress. They did not scream or blaspheme. Instead, they sat in perfect silence, their heart rate slowing to levels that should have been fatal. When they did speak, it was in unison, reciting a series of astronomical measurements that were later found to match the orbital decay of a dead star system. The Vatican's response was swift. The reports were confiscated. The witnesses were moved to isolated monasteries, and the phenomenon was officially labeled as a collective psychological delusion fueled by non-human interference. But the priests who were there knew the truth. They had heard the resonance. They had felt the air vibrate with the weight of a consciousness that was older than the mountains. It is said that in the private chapel of the Pope, there is a list of 72 names. These are not the names of saints. They are the names of the original Watchers, as recorded in the fragments of the lost tablets. Each name is accompanied by a specific frequency, a tone that is said to be used in the most secret of rites to bind the ancient ones if they should ever manifest in their true form. This is the true purpose of the high-level exorcist training. It is not about faith. It is about acoustics. It is about understanding that the universe is built on vibration, and that the Watchers are the masters of that sound. The Church calls it spiritual battle, but in the secret manuals, it is described as a maintenance of the barrier, a barrier designed to keep the human mind tuned to the low frequency of the earthly plane, away from the high, luminous broadcasts of the celestial teachers. When you see the news of a new exorcist being appointed or a new center for spiritual healing being opened by the Church, remember that they are not just looking for the devil. They are looking for the signal. They are looking for anyone who has started to remember the language of the stars. They are looking for the children of the Nephilim who might be waking up to their inheritance. Because the most dangerous thing in the world to an institution built on mystery is a person who has been given the keys to the map. The Watchers gave us those keys once. The Church spent 2,000 years trying to change the locks. And tonight, as you look at the stars, ask yourself who is really watching whom. Is the Vatican protecting your soul, or is it guarding the exit? The answer is hidden in the silence of the manual, in the rhythm of the ancient spirit, and in the memory of the light that never truly fell. It only went into hiding, waiting for a generation that is no longer afraid to listen. We live in an age that prides itself on logic. We have mapped the human genome, split the atom, and sent machines beyond the edges of our solar system. We tell ourselves that the ghosts of the past have been laid to rest, that the demons our ancestors feared were merely shadows of an uneducated mind. But the deeper we go into the light of science, the more we find the same shapes waiting for us. The myths we thought we had buried have not disappeared. They have simply changed their clothes. Today, we do not speak of Watchers or fallen angels in the town square. We speak of extraterrestrial intelligence, of interdimensional beings, and of genetic anomalies that defy the laws of evolution. But if you look closely at the data, you will see the same names echoing through the static of the digital world. The Vatican knows this. They have always known. While the public was told to pray and obey, the inner circles of the Church were watching the skies with a different kind of intensity. They were not looking for a spiritual heaven. They were looking for the return of the architects. Consider the Vatican Observatory. It is one of the oldest in the world. Its telescopes are not just in Italy. They are perched on the mountains of Arizona and tucked away in the highest reaches of the Andes. The Church claims they are searching for the wonders of creation. But why does an institution built on faith need a sophisticated infrared telescope named Lucifer to scan the deep voids of space? The acronym stands for something technical, according to the official reports. But names have power, especially for the Vatican. To name a device that watches the stars after the light bringer is not an accident. It is a signature. It is a silent admission that the one they once cast down as a demon is the same one they are now searching for in the dark. They are waiting for a frequency. They are waiting for a pattern. They are waiting for the final seal to break. In the laboratories of the 21st century, the story of the Nephilim is being rewritten in the language of biology. For decades, scientists have been puzzled by what they call junk DNA, large sections of our genetic code that seem to serve no purpose. But some rogue geneticists have begun to suggest that these sequences are not junk at all. They are encrypted. They are a dormant legacy left behind by an outside influence. The Sumerian tablets spoke of the Watchers mixing their essence with the dust of the earth. The church called this a sin against nature. They called the resulting offspring monsters and giants. But modern science is finding that our sudden leap in intelligence, our sudden mastery of language and tool making, does not fit the slow crawl of natural selection. It looks like an intervention. It looks like a gift. If the Watchers gave us the code for thought, then our very existence is the evidence of their descent. The demons of Vatican wanted us to fear maybe the very ancestors who made us human. The struggle for modern mind is not between religion and science. It is between those who want to hide our origins and those who want to reclaim them. The Vatican has spent 2,000 years building a wall between humanity and the celestial teachers. They created a monopoly on the divine. They told us that any knowledge that did not come to their doors was dangerous. They took the luminous ones who walked beside us and painted them with horns and tails. They turned a story of partnership into a story of possession, but the wall is cracking. Every time a new archaeological site is uncovered in the sands of Iraq or Turkey, a piece of the old truth resurfaces. We find cities older than the flood. We find star maps that are more accurate than the ones used by Columbus. We find the names of the seven who descended carved into stones that were old when Moses was born. The church can no longer burn the books. They can only try to manage the narrative. But the narrative is escaping. In the quiet corners of the internet, in the classified files of government whistleblowers, and in the private journals of high-ranking priests, the same message is appearing. The Watchers are not gone. They were never gone. They are the silent partners in our history. They are the ones who whisper the laws of physics to the thinkers of the Renaissance. They are the ones who provided the geometry for the cathedrals. They are the ones who are now appearing in our skies with increasing frequency. The Vatican calls them a threat to the faith. They prepare the world for a coming deception. They say that when the skies open, we must not believe what we see. They are setting the stage for one last act of censorship. They want to ensure that when the teachers return, we see them as invaders rather than as parents. They want to keep the final seal intact. The final seal is not a physical object. It is a state of mind. It is a belief that we are small, that we are alone, and that we are inherently broken. The Vatican thrives on this belief. It needs a humanity that feels like a lost sheep. But the story of the Watchers tells us something else. It tells us that we were born from a union of earth and star, that we were given the keys to the universe by beings who saw our potential, that our history is not a march of sin, but a journey of awakening. To reconcile the myth in the modern age is to realize that the demons were only demons because they offered us freedom. They were cast down because they wanted us to stand up. The church called a fall, but for humanity, it was the first step toward the light. We are now at a crossroads. The technology we have developed is finally catching up to the wisdom the Watchers left behind. We are beginning to understand the vibration of matter. We are beginning to see the connections between consciousness and the stars. We are becoming the architects. And as we do, the power of the old institution fades. The Vatican knows that its time as the gatekeeper of the soul is coming to an end. This is why they are so desperate to control the disclosure of non-human intelligence. This is why they have spent billions on their observatories. They want to be the first to greet the returning masters, so they can be the ones to translate the message. They want to be the ones who tell us what to think one last time. But the message does not belong to them. It belongs to the dust that became us. It belongs to the people who still look at the night sky and feel a pull that no sermon can satisfy. It belongs to the researchers who refuse to be silenced and the dreamers who remember a world where the gods walked among men. The final seal is breaking because we are choosing to remember. We are looking past the labels of heresy and the fear of the demonic. We are seeing the Watchers for who they truly are, not as enemies of God, but as the messengers of a truth that is too big for any one religion to hold. They're the ones who gave us the fire of thought. And now, it is up to us to decide what to do with that flame. As we move into this new era, the distinction between the physical and the spiritual will disappear. We will realize that the miracles of the past were the sciences of the future. We will see that the angels and demons were the same beings, viewed through the lens of those who want to control us. The reconciliation of the myth is the end of the age of obedience. It is the beginning of the age of understanding. The Watchers are waiting for us to stop being children. They are waiting for us to realize that the heaven we were taught to fear is not a place we go after death, but reality we create here on earth. The Vatican may try to keep the Black Vault sealed. They may try to hide the Codex Vigilatum, but they cannot stop the stars from rising. The pattern is complete. From the mud of Sumer to the marble of Rome, to the silicon of the modern world, the story has remained the same. It is a story of light mistaken for rebellion. It is a story of a parent being called a stranger. But the truth has a way of returning to the surface. It hums beneath the layers of translation. It glows in the dark rooms of the archives. And it shines in the eyes of everyone who dares to ask why. Why was the history of our species edited? Why were our teachers turned into monsters? And what would happen if we finally stopped being afraid of the dark? The Watchers did not fall so that we would worship them. They fell so that we would follow them. They gave us the gifts of language, metal, and time so that we could build a bridge back to the source. The church spent centuries trying to burn that bridge, but the foundations were laid in our very blood. The final seal is our own silence. And when we finally speak the names of those who came before without fear, the seal will vanish. We will realize that we were never alone. We were never lost. We were only waiting for the light to remember itself. Before you turn away from this journey, take a moment to look at the world around you. The symbols are everywhere. The geometry is in your city. The code is in your cells. The stars are in your sky. You are the inheritance of the Watchers. You are the living proof that the church failed. They call them demons, so that you would never look them in the eye. But when you do, you will not see a monster. You will see a mirror. You will see the architects of your own soul. And you will realize that the greatest secret was never that the Watchers fell. It was that they stayed. They are watching still, and they are waiting for you to wake up.